Okay guys, Deathloop. Deathloop is a PS5 console exclusive that's also coming to PC, but it's not coming to last-gen consoles, and I'm so interested to see what that means for its system requirements, especially for the minimum system requirements. Because most games that we see these days are still programmed with the fact that they are going to try to run on a PS4 or an Xbox One. And on that aging hardware compared to modern CPU and GPU specs for PC hardware, a lot of times that means the minimums to get in the game are pretty low and reasonable. Let's take a look at what's going on with Deathloop. So, first of all, we could jump in actually quickly into, I think I have it up here if you're interested on like some of the related details. I don't want me to disappear, there we go. Sorry guys, we're filming this thing in one take. I just got home from work. I'm busy. New school year started. All of that stuff. Anyway, so if you're interested in the release dates and the preload times, you've got that right here. Feel free to take a look. Slightly more interestingly, at least to me, is the they are giving us the advanced graphics settings that will be available in the game. And the things that stand out to me really highly here are the fact that we're going to have FSR support. So FSR is awesome. If you're unaware, I mean, if you follow my channel, you probably are aware, but you might have just clicked on this video randomly. FSR renders the game at a lower resolution and then upscales it. It works really well at 4K and gives you a huge performance boost at almost identical visuals at 1440p. It works really well, maybe slightly more noticeable. There's a change in visual quality. And then at 1080p, you'd use it in a pinch if you had to. It's not perfect. This is similar in the goal of DLSS, but the nice thing here is this runs on basically all relatively modern GPUs from AMD or NVIDIA, which is nice to see. As far as I can tell, by the way, it doesn't look like we have DLSS support in the game from anything I've seen. It looks like we'll be getting good ultra-wide support, and we'll be getting adjustable field of views. All of things are nice to see from a PC gaming perspective. Now let's take a look at these minimum specs, because check this out. First thing that jumped out at me when I saw this was a 12 gigabyte RAM requirement. Now it's not VRAM, don't get confused, it's not your GPU, but 12 gigabyte RAM requirement. This is usually 8 still. Usually it's, in most system requirements I see, are 8 gigabytes at the minimums and 16 recommended. We're seeing 12 at the minimum now. And notice at this minimum, thank you Bethesda, by the way, like I thanked Ubisoft last time, maybe this is turning into more of a trend. They're actually giving us the resolution and frame rate and settings target that these are talking about. So this is only 30 frames per second at 1080p with the low settings, guys. And it's not only requiring 12 gigabytes of RAM, I'm actually really interested to see how the game performs with 8, and if this was really necessary or not. Maybe it is, we'll see. But anyway, look at these CPUs. Look at these CPUs. We got an i5 8400 at 2.8 gigahertz or an AMD Ryzen 5 1600. Here's why this is interesting to me. Usually we still see minimum CPUs in a lot of games as kind of an older 4-core 4-thread or maybe 4-core 8-thread. Look at these chips, guys. I'm over here at Tech Power Up. Oops, that's not the page though. Here we go. I'm over here at Tech Power Up's CPU database, and check this out. The i5 8400 is a 6-core 6-thread chip from 2017. That's fairly modern, although it is aging, and it's 6-core, not 4-core. That's really interesting. The AMD equivalent that they're giving is the Ryzen 5 1600. This is a 6-core 12-thread chip, so more threads. This has hyper-threading, while the Intel chip didn't, and it also released around the same time. However, my knowledge off the top of my head is that at this point in time, Intel's chips were generally still delivering stronger single-core performance, which is why maybe the extra threads here are what's keeping this in line with this Intel chip from around the same time period without the hyper-threading. Which would also lend me to believe that this game can take advantage of more than 6 threads, if that is what's bumping this up to about even. So, pretty interesting that this is a 6-core minimum, and again, just have to remind you, that's for 30 FPS. Yeah. All right, jumping over to the graphics, we've got a GTX 1060 6 gigabyte, and the Radeon RX 580 8GB. Now, the 1060 is still, according to Steam's hardware surveys, last time I saw it a month or so ago, still the most popular GPU. So they're targeting that, but again, this is for 30 frames per second, 1080p low settings. And the RX 580 is very similar in performance on average. Let's actually jump over to Tech PowerUp's GPU database so you can get an idea where your chip falls in relative to these. Do you fall short? Because I know a lot of people don't know all these numbers off the top of their heads compared to their chip. So first of all, I do want to point out that the 580 and the 1060 do, on average, perform about equally, which is really... which probably means that this is not going to be one of the games that favor either AMD or NVIDIA GPUs more so than the other. So like, you know how a lot of times a game like Assassin's Creed Valhalla tends to have AMD overperform compared to what they usually do to relative NVIDIA GPUs. And there's games that kind of work the other way around where NVIDIA cards overperform. This is showing me that this game is probably pretty even in terms of whether it favors AMD or NVIDIA, which is, I think, good to see. Now, where do you fall? Let's say you have something like a GTX 970. Well, okay, you're at 92% of the 1060, although the 970, I had one, was a 4GB card. And they were very specific to highlight 1066 GB. So even though a 92% performance wouldn't scare me off normally, if you can't go below 6 GB of VRAM and have decent performance, that could be brutal. Although we could see things like, okay, play lower than 1080p, and that's where maybe FSR comes in, and a FSR might upscale, might look a little better than just running the game at 720p. Now again, you might fall short of these requirements down here. Like a 1650 is 78% of the performance. Maybe you've got a 960, that's 58% of the performance. So keep in mind that since that recommendation was 1080p 30 frames per second low, yeah, if you're on something like a 960 with that 58 performance and you're probably below the recommended VRAM, I think the minimum gateway into this game is pretty brutal because it's not designed to support those older consoles. So if you're on an older system, we'll see how it goes. But anyway, let's jump up to what if you wanted to still be at 1080p, but jump up to 60 frames per second at high settings. So, pretty good settings, 60 frames per second, you're still running a 1080p screen. Well, check this out. I mean, the memory jumping up to 16 for recommended is pretty standard. However, look at the CPUs. We're jumping up to a i7 9700K and a Ryzen 7 2700X. Those are both 8-core chips, although the Ryzen 7 is able to hyper-thread to 16 threads, and the i7 is just 8-core, 8-thread. But again, I think we see that usually the Intel had stronger single-core performance, and then again, this might mean that this thing can really take advantage of multi-threading, listing this as the AMD equivalent. However, to my knowledge, correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not a console expert, but to my knowledge, the CPU inside of the new consoles, like the PS5, is very similar in performance and architecture to the 2700X. I think it is an 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 processor. So that could very well explain why that is the recommended for 60 FPS gaming here. Now, if we jump up to the GPUs, we're seeing a RTX 2060 6GB and RX 5700 8GB. Now, one thing here that might be good news if you're on the minimums is given the fact that the jumping up to high settings is still only saying 6GB, and a lot of times increasing graphics settings can increase the VRAM usage. That might mean people below 6GB could still have a shot at the low settings, even though this seems to imply they don't. No guarantees there, but you might have a shred of hope. Okay? Now, with this in mind, let's take a look at the 2060 and the Radeon RX 5700, which is an 8GB card. I think I have that right here. So the 2060 and the 5700, once again, are pretty much even in performance on average, once again lending to me believing that this is not going to favor one architecture highly over the other. Now, where do you fall in comparison to this? So if you have, a newer chip like a not newer, but a stronger chip like a 2070, obviously you can do a little bit better. Here's where a 3060 falls, 5700 XT. So you can kind of scroll through here yourself. I'll have a link to this database in the description to the video, so you can get an idea where you'd be at here. So if you're, and then you can also look at where you'd fall below this. Now, you could kind of read this percentage as like you'll get that percentage of 60 FPS if you were running at those high settings, and then you turn some settings down to try to get back to that 60 FPS. So, if you're on like a 1660 Super, you're at 83% of this recommendation. All right, you can take a look and find your GPU in that thing if I didn't happen to scroll through far enough for you to see it. Okay, let's jump up to the last thing they gave us, and then I'll speculate about 1440p, because I wish they gave us 1440p, because honestly, a lot of people are playing at 1440p these days. Probably more so than 4K. But hey, Ultra 4K specs, 4K 60 FPS Ultra settings. Notice that they're now bumping the CPUs up yet again. Now I feel like maybe that's unnecessary, because usually if you can get 60 FPS at a lower resolution, usually bumping up the resolution doesn't really bump up the CPU demand too much. Hey, maybe it does though, or maybe they're just trying to give you a smoother 60 FPS, and maybe at the 1080p version that you'd be dropping a bit below. But they're jumping the processors all the way up to an i9 10900K and a Ryzen 7 3800 XT. Now a 10900K is a very new and very high-end chip. I would wager that the vast majority of people watching this video don't have a CPU this good. But you're also probably not gaming at 4K. But hey, this is a 10-core, 20-thread chip. Okay, guys, from 2020. Now, the Ryzen 7 3800 XT is an 8-core, 16-thread chip, also from 2020. So we're still 8 cores, 16-thread, but apparently they're at least trying to claim that for the smoothest of 60 FPS gaming at the highest settings, you're going to want a really beefy CPU. Again, 16 gigabyte of RAM, staying there. Now the graphics cards are basically just jumping up to, you need, well, not the best, but the high end if you're not going for the 3090 or the 3080 Ti, 6900 XT. Now, once again, these are very evenly matched chips. So we see the 3080 and the 6800 XT at 4K, generally being within 3% of each other, although certain games, again, will favor one highly over the other. And, if you did buy one of those absolute monster chips, you'll get a little bit better performance, so, a little bit better than your 60 FPS. And then, you can see where you fall below this here. Now, I'll read into what I predict for 1440p a little bit in a second here. But let's talk about this for just a bit longer, which is, as far as I can tell, and with most games, they're generally, if they support DLSS or FSR, they're not factoring that into these recommendations. So again, the fact that this game supports FSR tells me that you could probably get above 60 FPS by kicking that onto ultra quality, and at 4K that looks almost identical to native, which is great. And then we could also probably see that you could handle higher frame rates or higher settings on these same GPUs that we saw down here, again with FSR ultra quality, although that doesn't look quite as good at 1080p, it's more noticeable. Now, 1440p, if I had to just do some ballpark sort of figures here, here's what I've got for you. I busted out a calculator because I'm a math teacher. So 1440p is this many pixels. 1080p is this many pixels. So 1440p, if we divide, is about 78% more pixels to drive than 1080p. So if we were going to just kind of speculate, okay, if I wanted to upgrade 1080p 60 FPS high settings to 1440p 60 high settings, I might increase the demand by, 75-ish%. Although, to be honest, this is not always how it works in all games, because not everything is as simple as just more pixels directly translates to exactly that amount of more performance. So please, you don't need to yell at me in the comment section. I know it's not always that simple. So if we take the 2060, which was the 1080p 60 FPS high setting GPU, and we look at what is about 75% or so more performant than that, that would be an RTX 3070, roughly, is the GPU I'm seeing fall closest to that number. 3070 Ti obviously being better, 2080 Ti maybe being slightly less. There you go. So now I would imagine, again, that you could deal with something a lot less than that by either slightly tweaking your settings or by using FSR, or maybe my, tablecloth napkin math here just isn't that accurate. But since they didn't give us 1440p, I thought I'd at least give you a ballpark sort of estimate. You guys can argue about it in the comment sections. All right, guys, I've got a lot of grading to do. I'm going to sign out here. Hope you enjoyed the video. Have an excellent day.